Well, today we're actually here to talk about how do we flourish in our faith. And so as an introductory question, I want to ask you, what does flourishing mean to you?
So I think flourishing in faith, it requires the feeding, the light. It requires food, it requires water. So I would say that's health. So flourishing faith requires health. But like in most things that grow, they also require things like manure, and they need fertilizers, and they need trials so that they become strong. So I think we also flourish in difficult times, times that are stormy, or times that are very, very challenging to our soul.
It's really good.
Yeah, I think for the Christian life, flourishing is when we are fully living into the person and the life that God is calling us into. So thinking through, it's not necessarily dependent on what the world defines as flourishing, or defined by even other external voices like friends or parents, even within Asian American context, and to be able to truly live into and bring all that you have into what you're doing in life. That's, I think, flourishing. Yeah.
Amen.
When I think about flourishing, I think about John 15:5, the vine and the branch. Jesus is the vine, we're the branch, and just really a dynamic, abiding connection with Christ in a real time, real personal intimacy. And I think when that is in place, I think then it says you'll bear much fruit. So I think that's what I think of when I think of flourishing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think about when I think about flourishing, especially with regards to our faith, is I think, what does it look like for me as an Asian American pastor to be fully present as an Asian American pastor? Fully understanding my family history, the history of, I'm Korean, so Korean Americans in the United States. And sadly, that's not something that I actually understood until I'm 42 at this moment. And I don't really fully think that I understood that until my late 30s, right? So for most of my life, I didn't understand what it meant to be an Asian American Christian, It was it was just something that in my mind was so portioned out, right? I had different compartments, and everything in my life was compartmentalized. And so when it comes to that, the idea of how we flourish in our faith, especially as Asian Americans, how do you navigate finding flourishing as, again, Asian American Christians in places where that's not really something that's talked about very often? Or, again, we're in a lot of Asian American communities where people don't know a lot of their history. They don't really know a lot of their own personal context. So I'm wondering, we have a lot of different age variety here. And I think it'd be great to pull in some wisdom, but what was that experience like for you in terms of better understanding how your Asian American identity and your faith kind of intersect together?
For what you shared, Kevin, about you just from 39 to 42, the fact of being Asian American and a pastor started to be something you processed. And for me, that process was very difficult. When I shared, I was about half the time of ministry, I was in a Asian American church where I fit in very well. And then the other half of the time I was in Chinese churches where I only fit in very well in the English ministry. And I think that's where so much of the challenge and the growth happened. I didn't like it, but the reality is that that's where the growth happened, was in the trial. But it was so hard for me because I don't speak Chinese, so I felt in many cases like a second-class citizen. I was even told that I wouldn't be a good pastor unless I spoke Chinese if I was going to be in a Chinese church, and that was by a key leader in the church. So those things are very hurtful and painful, and you're dealing with your sense of call with God.
Right.
So I think that it's hopefully encouraging anybody listening that this is a real process. If you trust that God's called you, then you really do need to stay. If you trust that God's called you. And for that to happen, you need your those who help you to flourish, just simply like a flower that's maybe dying, but you put a wire there to hold it up so it can grow again. And I think that's what I needed. I needed these wires, like my wife, around me to keep me from wilting and dying, so that the nourishment could come back. But I do think that the culture aspect also helped me to understand more about both myself and maybe the hurts of other people. And it never came down just to a cultural issue, I don't think. I think that ultimately, you know, like Dave said, it comes down to being part of Christ, and these people were part of Christ. And I think in the same passage Dave alluded to, the gardener prunes, and he prunes it so it will grow. Yeah, he doesn't prune it so it will hurt.
Yeah.
Right? He prunes it so it will grow. And so I think that process of being Asian American in the church, both for the people who come and for the people who serve, is not necessarily a smooth or easy one. Yeah. And that's 38 years maybe of experiences for myself. So, you know, speaking from a longer time of struggle. And my mentor, who was doing English ministry 20 years before me, you know, he had a really hard time, but he invested in me to help me to be able to continue during the tough times.
Wow. Now to clarify, are you second or third gen?
I'm like 1.5 in a way.
One, okay.
Wait, the Chinese count it. So my dad was born in China and my mom was born here in the States.
I see. Wow.
Well, my experience, depending on how you count, right?
Yeah.
So I'm either a third, fourth, or fourth, fifth generation Chinese American.
Okay.
So this question of what it means to be Asian American has, I guess, never been on. It wasn't on my radar when I was young.
Yeah.
So when I was growing up in a historic Chinese American church, it'll turn 140 years old next year. And my family, part of my family has been a part of that church since its founding. So a part of me was there because of family. And I think that's something that, you know, Asian Americans, we go where our families are. But it wasn't until I was like in college when I started just realizing, you know, God made me Chinese American. You know, he could have chosen to birth me into any sort of other ethnic diversity, any other place, any other point of history throughout humanity, but this is where I belong, that God has put me in. So that kind of started my journey of reflecting on what does that mean? Why did God see fit to create me as a, you know, pretty Americanized Chinese American? So that's something I think that I'm still continuously exploring, especially, you know, I don't speak any sort of Chinese. My grandparents spoke Cantonese. I studied Mandarin for a little while, but didn't really get me that anywhere. So what does that mean when I guess, you know, I don't have that language tie. I don't have a homeland tie. I don't have. I might have relatives. I'm sure I have relatives back in China, but I've never met them. I don't know who they are. So yeah, I guess when I'm asked questions about Asian American Christianity, so much of what I know, I think, is shaped by majority culture. But I think that even then, being so far removed from the immigrant generations of my family, there are still pieces of that Chinese experience or the heritage that I still have. So exploring that more has been, just a really impactful journey for me.
For me, so I'm a second generation. I'm 54, so there wasn't as many Koreans around, at least second generation at that time. So I had a lot of identity confusion in terms of, am I American, Korean? I used to always say I'm American with Korean heritage, but I emphasized the American. I was, thought I was white. and so had a shame around my culture, you know, like in the opening up the refrigerator to my friends, and you know, that's a typical, what's this smell? It wasn't until I went to college, and I went to Korean church, but I also went to American church, kind of in both. In high school, I went to an American church. That I became a Christian, true born again. So I was a nominal Christian until I became truly born again my freshman year. And then I found my identity in Christ. And then I was also a part of a primarily Korean American church. So that really helped me discover that aspect, which I realize is really, really important. You know, it's not my primary identity is as a Christian, but part of the way that God, you know, created me was as a Korean American, and to really be able to embrace that, to let go of the shame that I had felt before, and you know, come to understand. I took Asian American Studies courses at Berkeley, and that really opened my eyes a lot to, you know, a lot of the racism that Asian Americans have faced, and that was really helpful to understand. That's part of my story, you know, and I know that there's a lot of different Asian groups. And so, as pastor of a church of primarily Asian American congregants, I think it's important for that kind of emphasis to, you know, our identity in Christ, but also to celebrate our ethnic identity. And recently, you know, with, you know, what AACC has been doing with the, you know, the Asian hate, I think that became also very, very important, you know, for Asians to stand up, Asian American Christians to stand up, you know, for justice. Yeah. And so that's, you know, been my journey.
Yeah. So what's interesting is I think the thing that ties it together for all of us in terms of our stories is there's definitely a sense in which we're like our lived-in experience, and then sort of our ability to articulate what our lived-in experience is in terms of our faith doesn't really happen until much later in life. But I have a question. So if you could go back and say something to your younger self who was struggling with these things, or maybe didn't struggle with it because wasn't even aware of it, what do you think you would say in terms of how this ought to have shaped our faith?
Yeah, I would have encouraged my younger self to, you know, let go of that shame, you know, that I had felt, that this is part of your God-given identity, something to be proud of. I think that would have, it would have made for a much, you know, more peaceful, you know, life. But I didn't have that. Yeah, I wasn't aware of all the dynamics that were going on. I was too busy trying to fit in and assimilate. So I would tell my younger self that I mean, your identity first is in Christ, but also to embrace your, you know, ethnic background and
you don't have to be ashamed to be Korean.
Yeah,
like it's not something to be ashamed of.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's interesting how something that simple, if it had come from a real sincere, like pastoral authority, could have healed and prevented us from so much angst and just
Well, I think like even my dad, who wasn't a Christian, said something to me once. I still remember as a young boy, I remember where I was standing when he told it to me. But he goes, "Curtis, you are in America and all that's great, but be proud that you're Chinese." And I think that would be the same thing I would say to my early Christian self, is just be proud that you're Chinese and embrace that. Embrace that and just see where it takes you. I didn't have any particular intention of serving in the Chinese church when I entered into the idea of going to seminary. But, you know, eventually as I was interned and asked, and it just naturally came out. I wanted to serve in a Chinese church if possible, or an Asian church if possible. So I think I would just say, like, let it be, enjoy it, embrace it. And I like very much what Michele said is that God could have made her anything else, but God made her Chinese American. God's exactly the same for me. We're very similar. Like, you know, Cantonese, no, don't speak Cantonese, you know, but look very Chinese, right? So it's like, embrace that. And when we were younger, I was younger than you, but, you know, if you don't speak and you are in a Chinese setting, you feel very looked down upon. Yeah. So it would cause you to clam up. It would cause you. So when that leader in the church told me I wouldn't be a good pastor unless I spoke Chinese, though I was much more mature, it still brought back a lot of hurt.
Yeah, when you're sharing, Curtis, I distinctly recall an interview I had with the church, and it was with first and second generation Chinese Americans, and everything was going really well, and we had a lot of like good vibes happening. And then I had a lunch with like their young adults, and then they asked me about my background, and when I said, I'm like, oh yeah, like fourth, fifth generation, they were just shocked. Like they had, like, I don't know if I've ever met anybody like that. And like I could tell there was a switch. There was a switch in the air. And I really do, I felt that. I felt the difference of what that means. Especially it was important for them to have the language aspect, to have kind of like this shared immigrant family experience that I didn't have. So yeah, I resonate with what you're saying. Yeah. I don't know what to do with that, but
That's really fascinating. So as a fourth and fifth gen, for you, you look at the immigrant experience, and there was a part of you that wished that you had that connection to a generation that had just come from the homeland.
well,
kind of.
I think what I end up doing is I see it as a learning opportunity.
Right, okay.
Right. So a lot of the churches that I work with, we have a lot of newer immigrant, refugee populations, and just being able to learn from their experiences and cultivating in our community a way of kind of like the older immigrant churches and the newer churches to have that mutual learning stance, that posture, right? Because there's so much that we can learn from each other.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wish and hope for that kind of communication and relationship.
That's fascinating, because I think for me, because of the way that I grew up in my house, because of the shame that I had internalized, I was also ashamed of my parents, right? Like I didn't like the fact that they didn't know how to speak English, or they spoke English with an accent. And so often they would ask, me and my brother to like translate for them. And it almost became a thing where it's like, well, I'm ashamed of when you speak English, so I'm just going to speak for you. But I didn't always exactly understand what my parents were trying to say either, because my Korean's not the best. So there was a lot of just weird brokenness that I think came from my own internalized shame, and it gets put on my parents. And then what happens is, theologically, I get to a place where I don't really know what it means to honor your father and mother. And so I always felt like, just from a sin perspective of how I talk to God the Father, it's like I'm always going to be inadequate because I don't know how to do this fifth commandment. Like this is the one that I like always so broken over, because I don't know how to do this, because it's just this internalized shame. So I think for me, it's like, I wish that I had somebody come alongside me to be like, you got to deal with that. You have to deal with that, because it's not just affecting you, it's affecting your relationship with your parents, but it also affects your relationship with God.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's like, but that stuff you're not going to learn in a majority culture, because they don't have a framework for that. There isn't a theological framework to even understand, like, when you talk about sin from the pulpit, and it only is communicated in sort of that, like, you're guilty because you did something wrong, but there isn't the depth of like, but there's actually shame that also comes along with sin. There's suffering that comes along with sin. And when we don't talk about those things, I think you do end up with a very simplistic version that then fractures your relationship with God. And so, I was just thinking about that as you were sharing, and it's like, that's it's so interesting. But I also think that because that was my experience, once I was able to articulate some of these things, or I had other people that were more attuned to these cultural dynamics and theology kind of together, it opened up a whole other world for me in terms of understanding theology, in terms of understanding what the Bible actually says about our faith and who we are in terms of our culture. And I think that was really powerful for me over the last couple of years to like really understand that and discover that. So to that end, I'm trying to think about how do we help people understand that better? And I think the question that I'm trying to formulate in my mind is, when we think about theological frameworks, so we're talking about, again, let's talk about the concept of sin, right? When we take away our cultural understandings of that. I think you can end up in places where people misunderstand what sin actually means. Are there any other sort of theological frameworks or theological themes even that you feel like intersect with our Asian Americanness that would be helpful to talk about? That's kind of the question I'm landing on.
Well, I think the biggest one is shame. And so I think the biggest biblical truth is grace. And I think that's what made sense to my father as he started to get to know about God. And the other one is creation. I think that, you know, the sense of a maker is something that, at least in my dad's life, who was more Chinese than my mom, he could understand, you know, and he came from an agrarian culture, and so he understood how things would or would not grow. He understood starvation, and if you can paint this picture into the hearts of those who maybe are just naive but not hard-hearted, then there is a God, a one God who is overarching, who sees and cares for you, for me, for us. And the difficulty, you know, can be many, of course, depending upon the person's history, but just from a basic sin point of view, there's guilt, right? You know, and so I think that we can talk about forgiveness, and then that leads directly into what we are very familiar with is, you know, the importance of sons in our lives and carrying on the family name, and then God giving His Son. So I think that it does require, though, I mean, it's not easy. That kind of sounds like maybe too simplistic, but I think that at least if there's a framework of trying to bring grace into the conversation of what God gives to all of us, in a framework that helps our more Chinese, more Korean, more Asian parents or grandparents, then maybe there's a place of conversation.
Yeah, I would say that shame is a really big thing in the Asian American, you know, more than just kind of the legal aspect of sin, but just that shame aspect, as opposed to guilt. And guilt is, you know, we experience that as well. And I think within the Asian American context, you know, I agree, Curtis, about grace. There really is a strong works-based, you know, understanding of God, our acceptance, performance-based acceptance, and that's so ingrained in our culture, you know, where we have to perform, and we just transfer that right over to our Heavenly Father. And so I think also in the Asian American context, just a really healthy theological understanding of the fatherhood of God, that, you know, I really, you know, resonate with Luke 15, you know, the father of the prodigal, and that's actually one of my favorite books, Henry Nouwen's Return of the Prodigal. But you know, our experiences, I think, my own experience with my father, you know, just not that intimate relationship, and it's a generational thing, cycle, that really, you know, the Bible talks about, and when we can, you know, dive in there, I think there's a lot of healing and wholeness, you know, that's very important in the Asian American context.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would probably add is thinking about the call of the church to continue meeting with one another, the community, the body of Christ, right? I think our Asian American cultures are being more community-centered, can lean more into what does it mean to do body life together well. Hopefully. I mean, there are always, like, you know, difficulties between intergenerational relationships sometimes, I should say sometimes, but by and large, I really do see that as a strength, because I feel like it comes so naturally It comes so naturally to us, to be able to care for one another, to honor privacy because of shame, right? Because so we understand that, okay, I understand you don't want to share that. I can appreciate and respect that. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that we can offer for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've been trying to do is trying to imagine some of the people in the Bible as Asian Americans. Not because that's theologically what I've been taught to, but I often have asked, if these characters were Asian American, would I understand what they do in the Bible better? Just because sort of the Middle Eastern culture, the ancient, Hebrew and Israelite culture, it's more like Eastern cultures than it is like Western cultures. And one of the fun things I've discovered is there was a story I was reading about Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael. So this is after Ishmael's born, Abraham's accepted him and is potentially thinking that Ishmael may be the chosen son. But then God tells Abraham, no, this is it. You're going to have another son. But at this point, Abraham's been father to Ishmael, and now he's got to send her away. He's got to send them away. And there's this weird part in the Bible where there's this verse that says, and so Abraham gave them bread for a day and then sent them away. And I was like, that's so jacked up. Why would Abraham do that? And then I thought about, okay, if I imagine Abraham as an Asian American father who's maybe a little bit disconnected, why would he only give his son a bread, like bread for a day? And I realized because then he can only travel a day's journey away. So the idea is that actually this is it's a passive aggressive, loving thing to do. But that opened up that story for me, and I was just like, "Oh my gosh! This can be a really interesting way to envision some of the characters in the Bible, and maybe when we run into some harder verses, to be like, well, just imagine that they were a Korean dad or a Chinese dad or a Filipino dad, and does that change at all for you? Maybe potentially the interpretations that could open up for that. And again, these aren't spelled out. There isn't a New Testament verse that says, "Well, Abraham did this because of Jesus." I wish there was. That would have been helpful to preach through that passage. But just a little bit of that just kind of unlocks an imagination for me that just makes the Bible feel more real and again closer to my heart, because now I'm like, oh, I understand that. I get that. And my dad's done that to me too, and I realize I do that to my kids too. And so it's just it's just there's this thing of God sees me in this, and I feel that sometimes when. So that's something that I think has been a new for me in terms of trying to recover some of that embodied culture inside the Bible.
I love that. That's good.
Yeah. So to that end, what do you find are some of the more significant forces influencing and impacting faith among Asian Americans and within the Asian American community?
I think in a positive manner, what I've seen has been homeschooling. That it has allowed for the family idea of the Asian culture and faith to come together. And the product has been predominantly positive. Students who love Jesus and who do well in school. And I know that, I was in thinking about that question, just sort of rolling around my head. I mean, are there, social constructs that are affecting us? Well, absolutely. Right? We talk about that in mental health and about the, social media and what it's doing to our youth. But I think that when it's positive, it is something that kind of fits the stereotypical Chinese Asian home environment of respect and of desire for the better life. Of course, it gets all out of whack, because I also think of the negative things that affect the spiritual life of our children, which would be school, sports, and status, and those things. But I think that outside of the church, there has been a very positive movement with the homeschooled families that I see.
I think, being a Korean American, I think, growing up, there was a lot of shame around being Korean American. That was kind of an outside kind of force of society, racism, basically. But now I think that there's been a lot of changes, like in the Korean context, I think just with the, you know, the K-wave of K-pop and all that Korean food and dramas. I think it's had a positive effect in terms of people celebrating their identity, and that also, you know, as Christians, Asian American Christians, I think it's a healthy thing, and I think that's a positive thing. I mean, although we, you know, we have the anti-Asian hate, which is a negative thing, but I think generally it's way different now than when I grew up. And so for our kids, I think that's something that enables them to embrace their identity in a healthy way more. And other Asian groups as well beyond Korean. But.
Yeah, I think the initial thing that comes to mind when I think of a force is, again, that family draw. And so many of the young people that I know, like my peers and younger, that are engaged in church life, it's because their parents or their aunts and uncles or their grandparents go. And that can be kind of like a double-edged sword, right? We're kind of talking about like there are pros and cons to that, right? It's good that they're there and that they're a part of the community, but how do you then how does the next generation, the young people, own the faith for themselves, right? And so that's, I think, where the intentionality has to come from church leaders, from parents, from older generations, to make it a space where these young people can encounter faith authentically. So yeah, I think it's good in the sense that in our culture, you can get them in the door, but then that also presents, you know, like with a age hierarchy, right? There are some difficulties that come with that as well. So yeah, but if you want to learn more about that conversation, you can watch the one about talking. What was the discipling
Discipling the next generation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you were saying about how, like, there's been a shift of this idea that because of, you know, what BTS has done, it's made Asian churches like viable options for faith. And I think that's huge, especially for the next generation. Like, we have a young adult actually she's attending our church. She's non-Korean, and she loves being a part of the Korean community because she's into K-pop, into K-drama, loves Korean food. And it's the weirdest thing for me to think about a non-Korean wanting to be at a Korean church. And it's healing for me, because I've always seen our churches, Asian American churches, as we're second class, you know, like, don't you want to go to the big mega church down the street? Like, they've got all this and they do all this, and we still have, you know, like rice and soup on Sundays. Like, but she's like, that's what I want. And I'm like, man, I don't know how to reconcile this. It's such a different thing for me, you know?
Yeah, we have a sister who's now a lay leader. She's a single Caucasian lady who loved Korean dramas. And the reason why she wanted to find a Asian church because of Korean dramas. That was the specific reason.
She wanted us to yell at them?
Yeah. And I found that really interesting, you know. It's like, it is kind of a, you know, head spinner kind of thing.
I don't know what to do with that sometimes. I'm like, so is this good or not?
Yeah,
you know,
I think it's a good thing.
But I think it's a good thing. It's like me realizing we have something deeply beautiful to offer. And people are waking up to that now. And all of a sudden we're a source for, again, a very unique perspective on faith, you know? And so we got to land the plane here. So the last question, but in what ways do you see the distinctions in how we as Asian American Christians express our faith? So that would be like one part of the question you can answer. And then the second one would be, what do you think other communities can learn from us as Asian American churches?
I have a friend who recently became a Christian, and I got to know her, and she was going to be baptized in our church. And she had a bit of a church history, but a difficult one. And she said that whenever I go into church, there's one thing that I'm looking for, and I found it in your church, and that I feel safe. And I think that, at least in a smaller, setting like our church setting, where people know each other, or people, genuinely want to reach out and share, it's associated with the culture, whether it's the church culture or not. For her, I think it was a bit of both. That, a non-Asian coming in felt loved. And I think that when we do it right, we do that well. And I think that that's something that the Asian church, very few Caucasian churches that I know of have a regular Sunday lunch.
Yeah.
And that's family. And I think in our world today, so many people don't have a real family. And the warmth of food. I mean, Jesus taught us to eat together. And so I think that we do offer a lot in that way that isn't in a neighborhood church, and nothing wrong with that, but is something that we offer that is different, that is meaningful and personal. And I think that's something very, very good for us not to think is old-fashioned or bad, but realize that these are our human needs for friendship, safety, and food.
I remember once I heard I won't name names, but I heard a very large white pastor once say, that's why we do communion every week, is so that we can come together and share this meal together. And I knew what they meant.
Yeah.
But I was like, that's like a piece of bread is not a meal, man. I was like, we do that. We really do that and do that every week. You should come to our church.
Yeah, I think Asian Americans bring an interesting perspective to the table because we really are carrying two cultures. We're carrying, the communal aspect that comes from the Asian perspective, but then also being part of this society which is more individualistic. So I think that kind of bicultural perspective, I think it gives you wisdom. And I think, Asian Americans can really bring that wisdom that comes from the bicultural perspective. And then I also agree, I think we do community well. And that's, the communal aspect of family, and church really is family, is a family. And I think that that's something that's really needed in our culture. Examples of churches that do community well. I mean, we're not perfect, of course, but I think we that's what we strive for in church, and we experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just want to name that we as Asian American Christians have something to offer to the table, right? So often, I think we shrink back in ourselves, or maybe there's some identity work that we need to do in ourselves as well, like looking at our histories. And but so often I have historically found myself, in my seminary class, I'm pretty quiet. I am thinking to myself, I internalize, and but there's something that I've learned about. When you're at the table, you need to claim the space that you're given. So I think I resonate with what both of you have shared, and I just really hope that Asian American Christians can really own and lean into the fact that, what we have is unique and is a part of the bigger family of God, right? So what we have, our voice, our experiences, whether you're first generation immigrant or a refugee to an older fifth generation Asian American, there's so much that we can give.
Yeah.
So, I guess I just want to name that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I also would love to add that one thing that I also feel like a lot of Asian American churches bring is actually a theological robustness, just because the academic drive that we all have. And so when it comes to study, right, if you're called to be a pastor, the assumption is so you're going to go to seminary because you got to study, you got to get the A, and you got to be an A+ student in theology. And then, but we do bring that to the table. I mean, legitimately, I do believe that. So, I was a youth pastor for a really long time, and in most Asian immigrant churches, they want their youth pastor to have an MDiv, right? That's a graduate level degree for working with junior high and high school students. to play games a lot. But the idea is that, but we want that because that's our desire. And I do think that we bring that to the table. And I do wish that people understood that more about Asian American churches. We are theologically robust. And we do emphasize preaching and teaching is a huge part of why we go to the churches that we go to. That's, that, food, community, right? Like those are the top 3 reasons why somebody goes to a church. And I think that's a distinctive of the Asian American church. And yeah, it's about time that we started pulling more resources together and putting stuff out there like these videos. So I want to thank you guys so much for being here. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say there's one more thing that I think is so powerful to us is this would be true if it was an African American, Black American Christian church, if it was a Hispanic American church, is that we're Christians and that our culture is transcended by Jesus and the culture he brought.
Right.
The culture of a new humanity, the culture of being a Jew, and that it shows that Jesus is for the world. And we're not trying to create a unique form of Christianity in the Asian American church, though this discussion is critical so that we can reach more people and so that those of us who are in it understand our place. But our place really is in the church of God's kingdom. Right? It's God chose to be a Jew. It's like we need to rejoice in that, right? And that makes us like, that grafted Gentile. Right. And we have much more to be thankful for. And I think that is what's bigger about this opportunity for us as Asian Americans, is to exalt a bigger kingdom where every tribe and every nation is represented. And it can promote missions because, many of our missionaries go to Asia, but many don't. Right? And that's what we can present to the world, is that we're much bigger than just about being Asian,
Yeah.
And we want to present God and Jesus in a very honorable and glorifying way. And it's not just about this world and about, how much we can be comfortable in a world where we aren't, but we're seen like a minority, and not to feel that way at all. But, we're part of God's family, and that's, that's our excitement. Yeah.
Well, yeah, with that word, we'll go ahead and close. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this. Thank you for being with us at the table. Thank you especially, again, to our panelists. This conversation was definitely a huge blessing to me. And I'm sure it's going to be a blessing to those who are listening. So if you found this helpful, we want to encourage you to share with others. Make sure you sign up for the AACC newsletter on our website, AsianAmericanChristianCollaborative.com or AAChristCollab.com. You can also follow AACC on social media at AAChristCollab. AACC is a volunteer-driven and donor-supported organization. So if you'd like to support the ministry, we encourage you to give online. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time.